The word destroying is doing a lot of work in this conversation. So is the word addiction. And before anything useful can be said about what is actually happening to this generation and what anyone, parent or otherwise, can actually do about it, both of those words need to be examined with some precision. Because the label you apply to a problem determines the solutions you reach for. And most of the solutions currently being reached for are reaching for the wrong mechanism. Here is what the research does and doesn't say. The clinical literature on addiction describes a specific state, compulsive engagement with a substance or behavior that produces escalating tolerance, withdrawal symptoms upon cessation, continued use despite documented negative consequences, and significant functional impairment across multiple life domains. Some researchers in behavioral medicine argue that smartphone use can meet those criteria in a clinical subset of users. The majority of developmental and clinical psychologists who study this question at scale reach a more precise conclusion. What most people describe as phone addiction is better characterized as behavioral dependency, a pattern of habitual, highly reinforced engagement that is difficult to interrupt but lacks the neurobiological profile of clinical addiction in the strict diagnostic sense. The distinction matters not because it minimizes the problem. It matters because behavioral dependency and clinical addiction require fundamentally different interventions. Treating a dependency pattern as addiction produces solutions calibrated for the wrong mechanism, which is most of what is currently happening in schools and households and legislative chambers simultaneously. And what is specifically happening to Gen Z is different again from either category. Developmental psychologist Lawrence Steinberg at Temple University has spent decades studying the adolescent brain's reward processing architecture. And what his research documents is that the adolescent nervous system is not simply an immature adult brain running at reduced capacity. It is a brain specifically calibrated by design to be maximally sensitive to social reward signals. The information about status, belonging, acceptance, and peer group standing that social environments provide during the years when humans are developmentally moving from family dependence toward peer group navigation. The adolescent brain is built to weight social feedback heavily, to find social novelty and peer validation neurologically rewarding at a level that the adult brain has already recalibrated downward, and to be more responsive to immediate social reward than to long-term consequences. That calibration is adaptive. It is what drives the social learning and peer bonding that adolescence is supposed to accomplish. And the smartphone arrived in the hands of Gen Z during the exact developmental window when that calibration was at its highest sensitivity. What the phone delivered to that brain was not simply entertainment or a distraction from other activities. It delivered, at high frequency and with essentially no friction, the specific category of stimulation the adolescent nervous system is most calibrated to pursue: social novelty, real-time social feedback, peer validation, and continuous low-grade awareness of where you stand in your peer environment. Previous generations had access to those same inputs through hallways, cafeterias, phone calls, notes passed during class. The difference was friction. The physical commute to school, the conversation that had to happen face-to-face, the time it took to get from one social situation to the next. That friction also, without anyone naming it explicitly as a developmental mechanism, functioned as calibration. The brain that waited for social feedback, that had to navigate real social environments in order to receive it, that experienced the reward as intermittent and contextual rather than continuous and on-demand, was being shaped in something that nobody thought to call training, because it was simply what adolescence used to look like. Picture this. It is 2016. You're 14 years old. The social reward inputs your developing brain is specifically calibrated to pursue are now available continuously, in your pocket, accessible in the 30 seconds between classes or the 3 minutes before the teacher starts talking. The feedback arrives in quantified, legible form, like counts, comment counts, follower counts, read receipts, that gives your reward-seeking system more precise information than a cafeteria conversation provides, with a fraction of the ambiguity, the social risk, the emotional cost of face-to-face navigation. The situations that previously required physical presence, social skill, frustration tolerance, and the capacity to manage unpredictable outcomes are now available in a form that has removed most of the friction. And the friction that was removed was also, incidentally, building most of the capacity. The social and emotional development that friction-bearing navigation was producing has been replaced by something that delivers the signal without the building process. And developmental capacity that is not built during the window when the brain is most plastic for that particular learning is not simply delayed. The window closes. The architecture that forms during it shapes what the adult brain is built on. This is what Jonathan Haidt's research, synthesized across more than a decade of collaborative work with Jean Twenge and documented in The Anxious Generation, published in 2024, has been establishing from multiple angles using large-scale longitudinal data. What smartphones did to the Gen Z developmental window was not primarily introduce a harmful input. They displaced a set of experiences. The unstructured, unsupervised, face-to-face social navigation that builds emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, risk assessment, and real-time social skill. This was the developmental content that the phone made consistently easier to avoid than to seek. The harm, in Haidt's model, is primarily one of displacement. Not something toxic introduced, but something necessary crowded out during the years when its presence was most irreplaceable. The American Psychological Association's 2023 Health Advisory on Social Media Use for Adolescents, reviewing the available research base, identified passive consumption and use that displaces in-person social engagement and sleep as the conditions under which adolescent social media use produces the most significant developmental concern, which is a significantly more precise finding than the phone is bad. What parents are currently doing with this information ranges from ineffective to counterproductive, and understanding why requires identifying which part of the mechanism the interventions are engaging. Screen time limits. The most common parental intervention in current household surveys. Address usage quantity. The theory is reduce the time the device is in use, and the brain gets more time doing other things. What the research consistently shows is that the relevant variable is not primarily the hours of phone use, but what the phone replaced during the developmental window, and what happens in the hours when the phone is not in use. A teenager whose screen time is limited to 2 hours a day, but who spends the remaining time in structured, adult-supervised, low-novelty activities is not recovering the developmental experiences that friction-bearing social navigation would have provided. The displacement question is not answered by absence. It is answered by what presence looks like in the absence, and creating the conditions for the specific type of presence that builds what smartphones displaced requires more than a rule. It requires an environment, one where the alternative to the phone is something more immediately engaging than nothing, in which the social friction that was removed by the device is carefully, specifically, gradually reintroduced. Here is what I want to say directly to whoever found this video first, whether you're a parent or the Zoomer who found this before your parents did. If you're a parent, the question worth asking is not how many hours per day the phone is in use. It is what the phone replaced in your teenager's daily developmental environment. The unstructured time with peers that generated social improvisation. The boredom that previously produced initiative. The face-to-face situations where social mistakes happened in front of a limited audience, weren't recorded, and didn't become permanent data. Those experiences are not recovered by screen time limit. They are recovered by creating specific conditions, consistent, low-pressure, interest-driven in-person social environments where the alternative is actually present and the friction is graduated rather than eliminated. That is a harder thing to architect than a rule, but it is the thing the research is pointing at. If you are a Zoomer reading this, the relationship your developing brain built with social feedback during its most sensitive calibration window is not your fault, and it is not your permanent neurological architecture. It is the output of a specific developmental environment applied to a brain at its most plastic moment. The capacity that the displacement made harder to build is harder, not inaccessible. It builds through the same mechanism that would have built it originally. Real social navigation, in person, with the friction reinstated. Uncomfortable, underscripted, unquantified. Not performative, not content, just actually present, with the outcome uncertain, in a room with real people. That is what the brain was built to run on. And it responds to that input even after the primary window, because the secondary plasticity that follows the primary window is more available than the word damage implies. The word destroying overstated the permanence. The word addiction misidentified the mechanism. What happened to this generation's developmental trajectory is more specific and more navigable than either word suggests. Knowing the mechanism doesn't make the intervention comfortable, but it changes what you're actually doing when you do it. If this gave language to something that has been difficult to describe accurately, whether you're the Zoomer who grew up inside this or the parent who watched it happen without a clear frame, say it in the comments. Sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing the right name for what it was. Like this if it reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.